Well, good morning and welcome to CEDA's global live stream on female workforce participation. I'm really pleased that you could join us today for what I think is going to be a fascinating conversation. I'm Melinda Cilento, the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands in which we're all joining this live stream from today? I'm on the land of the Gadigal people in the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders and also acknowledge the continuing connection that the Gadigal people have to this land and their custodianship of it, and recognise that in the spirit of reconciliation in this important year when we contemplate a voice to Parliament. I think we are in for a great discussion today. Obviously, all things female workforce participation has been a really hot topic here in Australia. You can actively participate in the conversation, obviously by tweeting your thoughts or jumping onto social media with insights and comments that we're making, but you can also ask questions via the Pigeonhole app, which allows you to pose your own questions, but also to vote on the questions of others. And given the topic today, I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions. So if you can jump on and help us to understand which are the most important to you, that'll make for, I think, a really interesting conversation. And hopefully you've got the details of all that on the screen. The backdrop for today's conversation really tracks back most recently to the Jobs and Skills Summit last year, where female workforce participation really featured very predominantly in that conversation, much to the credit of the federal government, who really kicked off with that and had it as a centrepiece of those conversations. Of course, when the Jobs and Skills Summit was first contemplated, it was expected to be against the backdrop of higher levels of unemployment given the pandemic, and really it was quite the opposite. So thinking about how we can continue to support female workforce participation and the barriers and challenges to that is really front and centre in the policy conversation here in Australia. To help us understand not only Australia's performance and perspectives, but also to put those into the context of other developing countries, and in particular the United States, we've got joining us today Professor Betsey Stevenson. Professor Stevenson is a world-leading expert on gender segregation in the workplace, women's labour force experiences, and the economic forces shaping participation in the modern family. She's the Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. She's also a Faculty Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a visiting Associate Professor of Economics at University of Sydney, which I think means she has some good Australian experience and insight. And so on. She served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 2015 when she advised President Obama. And I'm going to stop there because the CV just goes on and on. Just a reminder, please jump onto Pigeonhole to ask your questions. What we're going to do is Betsey's going to make some opening comments and then we're going to jump into some Q&A. I've got a few questions for her based on the conversation we were having before we jumped online. So, and then we'll jump to your questions as well. So thanks, Betsey. Thanks so much for joining us, and over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It is really good to be here today and get to have this conversation about what's happening in the labor force in Australia, and in particular, what's happening for women. You know, I think it's a really important conversation to be having right now. And I just want to credit you for highlighting this. And, you know, not a lot of people might be focusing on, hey, what's happening with women? But if you think about what's happening in the labor market in Australia and in almost all advanced economies, what we're seeing is incredibly tight labor markets, labor markets and high demand for goods and services that is creating upward pressure on prices. And we see things like the RBA reacting by raising rates. Well, what else could we do? Well, one of the things we can do is expand potential GDP. And expanding potential is all about trying to get more people to be able to work if that's what they want to do, work more hours. expanding the number of people we have providing those goods and services. So figuring out what are the barriers that might be limiting Australians who want to be in the labor market, who want to work more hours or would like to enter when they're not entered at all. Eliminating those barriers has important macroeconomic implications. So, sometimes when we start talking about women in the labor force, people think of this as some sort of niche aspect, but it's not. This is talking about the labor force, and it's talking about whether we have an economy that can produce all the things that we want to produce. So I want to highlight that and just say how important it is. If you look at Australia, we can tell the glass half full story. That's the great story. Look at the upward trajectory that Australia's had in female labor force participation over the last 40 years, right? You go back to 1980 and the United States female labor force participation was 15-20% higher than that in Australia. You look at it today and guess who's winning the race? Good for you, Australia. Australian female labor force participation is higher today. Now, so that's what's good. What are the challenges? Well, the challenges are things like Australian women, more than women in most other countries, work part-time. And they work part-time because childcare in Australia is more expensive than it is in most other countries, even when we take a look at the subsidies and supports that the government's already offering. So that's the glass half empty. You're getting your women in the labor force. They're getting, they're getting their foot in the water. They're dipping their toe in, but they're not all the way having a good swim. And they're not doing that because there are some structural barriers in the way. There are some other barriers that I'm hoping we're going to be able to go through in terms of thinking, in terms of our conversation today. And some of those are around, who is really championing women? Who is pushing for them to get promoted? Is there really, the sort of space for that? And is there any kind of systematic way in which we're making sure that both women and men are getting the same kinds of backings in the workforce to get the promotions they need to encourage them? And then I think we also do have to look really hard at things like occupational segregation around what causes it, and is that creating an important barrier that's limiting our ability to have people do the work at which both Australia needs and in which their skills might be best suited. So I'm excited today for this conversation. And Melinda, why don't I kick it over to you so we can start chatting?
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. And some really great points that you've made there already. Let's start just where you started in terms of acknowledging the fantastic increase in female labour force participation that we've seen here in Australia. It's been remarkable and probably something that we've underestimated, if you like. You've said that sort of surpassed the US. Interested to understand what you think's going on there in the US relative to what's happening here. But also, if you could just help, it is, as you noted, it's a really key feature here in Australia that a very large proportion of women work part-time. Is that the case in the US? And is childcare the main feature, do you think?
So really very few women work part-time in the US. Part-time work is just not real work in the US and in a lot of ways, right? So obviously not to disparage anyone who does part-time work, but there are not a lot of opportunities for people pursuing a career to be able to do that part-time. Job sharing is more common in my anecdotal experiences in Australia than in my anecdotal experiences in the US. So I've run across more people in a job share arrangement. And I think that, that when we look at countries where women have that ability to do part-time work or job sharing, what we see is that brings people in who really, they don't want to be in full-time. They want to be home with their kids. They want to be, able to participate, but 40, 50 hours a week's a lot of hours if you've got young kids at home. And so it's good in that way. And I think it can boost labor labor supply, boost labor force participation, because there's some women who are like, look, if it's 50 hours or nothing, I'm going to choose nothing. But on the other hand, I think women get stuck in part-time jobs and job sharing positions. And what we really need, and I think neither the US nor Australia is doing a very good job of this, is we need to build better on-ramps so that you can, put your career into high gear when you're ready, and then put it into neutral when you need to. And this isn't just like, oh, it should be able to be in neutral when I'm 32 and have my first child, but you might be 50 and your aging mom really needs you. And, you don't want to miss those last 2 years of her life. Like, you want to be there for her. And for a lot of people, you make that choice to be there for your aging mom, and you're making a choice to basically flatline your career forever. And that's crazy. Right. And that's the problem of us not being able to dial it up and dial it back.
So do you think that's something that's happening more obviously in the US? Because it's not I don't think that's something that's happening here in Australia. And we see it, for instance, in the references we make in our report to the motherhood penalty, where women, as soon as you hit the stage where you're having kids, and you notice it in your incomes, and that just persists. And there is, not a lot of evidence, I think, of really serious job sharing. It's starting to improve. But one of the things that we call out is the need to really sort of formalise flexibility, which I think is where job sharing goes. And I think that's we've got a long way to go in Australia with that. So do you think you're seeing more of that in the US? And we've got a couple of great examples of job sharing, including two sort of leaders of one of the big businesses here in Australia who share that responsibility, but there's not a lot of examples of it.
Well, yeah, I don't think there are not a lot of examples of it. And in the US, job sharing is almost non-existent. I think there's a difference between job sharing and workplace flexibility. So one is about like, how many hours a week do you want to work? And if you want to do something that requires somebody working full time, even let's say you're a teacher, but you only want to work 15, 20 hours a week, then you're going to do that by entering into some sort of job sharing arrangement where somebody else is going to take the other side of that 15 to 20 hours, or 25 to 30, so that you can get to a real 40-hour week job. So that's where I think the job sharing comes from. Flexibility is not necessarily about, I want to work fewer hours. It's just that I want to be able to work those hours when it works best for me, right? We do have a lot of hours in the week, and not every 40-hour job should be done between the hours of 9 and 5, right? And sometimes there's lots of companies who recognize that very easily when it comes to their business choices. They want you to take a 7 p.m. meeting because your client's in another country, and all of a sudden they're all pro flexibility. But you want to leave at 3 so you can get your kids home from school, and you're going to log back on at 7 and catch up. Well, they don't seem to be as supportive as they are if they're thinking you're doing it in the service of the client. But in reality, what people tell us in survey after survey is that if they have control over their hours, they can get their work done more efficiently. So I think flexibility is about letting people be as efficient as possible and working full-time jobs or in part-time jobs. But it's not really about the number of hours. Flexibility is about giving people enough control over their schedule to optimize in a way that allows them to be more efficient at work and more efficient in their home life.
Just going back to the issue of segregation, I mean, that's one of the obviously key focus of our last piece of research. And it was interesting, I think, notwithstanding the focus on greater female participation and the real push on diversity and inclusion in workplaces, that we're still seeing very segregated labour markets in Australia, in the sense that, or occupations in Australia, where you've got heavily female-dominated sectors. And really what's happened is, as female labour force participation has increased, women are going into sectors that are already very heavily female-dominated. We've seen a little bit of progress in some sectors that are heavily male-dominated, but probably surprisingly not as much as we've seen. Is that the case in the US as well?
Yes. So, I mean, the occupational segregation across sectors in Australia and the US look very similar. Now, one answer to this is that over the last 30, 40 years, our demand for healthcare has grown enormously. And that's happened at a time when women have entered the labor force quite rapidly. And so what are the jobs they're going to? Well, they're filling our demand for healthcare. So it started as a pretty heavily segregated occupation, but our demand for that has grown at the same time women have come in. And I think that has helped facilitate the fact that, I think the numbers, they're really similar. So now I'm all confused, but I think it's like 78% of healthcare jobs in the US are female, and it's maybe 76 or 79 or something in Australia. Very, very similar. And I, that in the US, it's like there's a chicken and the egg question. Female labor force participation has grown, particularly over the 10 years prior to the pandemic, faster than male participation did. And the biggest place where jobs grew was in education and health. And those are very female dominated. So some of that is just women are taking the jobs in the places where job creation is happening. The biggest sort of the industries that are expanding most are these female dominated. Now, what we've seen in the US since the pandemic, and I think this is what's really telling, is the pandemic was the first recession that really hammered these female-dominated service sectors like education and health services. A lot of women lost their jobs in those sectors. The sectors have started to grow back. But I don't know enough about the dynamics in healthcare in Australia of what happened during the pandemic. In the US, it really got hit, and it's nowhere near its its pre-pandemic growth trajectory. And so what happened? Well, women lost a lot of jobs in the pandemic in the US. They've been coming back. They found, well, there's not rapid enough growth in healthcare jobs and education jobs. So we have seen enormous growth of women in construction, of women in mining, of women in transportation and warehousing. Why? Because those have been the sectors that have grown the most. So let's just take construction, right? Construction, the US is like Australia. I think maybe Australia is like 11% women. The US is like 13% women. But if you look since February 2020, male employment in construction is about 2% higher than it was in February 2020. Female employment in construction in the United States is about 12% higher than it was in February 2020. So we needed to hire people, women came. So I think it's, one of the things we see in the data is women tend to be more flexible about what industry they'll go into when they need a job. And men tend to be really picky around, like, this is what I do and I need a job of what I do. And women, particularly in the US, single mothers are like, I got to put food on the table. The warehousing is hiring. And so we've seen a lot of that in the last 2 years.
Yeah. There's a question that's come through on Pigeonhole, and just a reminder to everyone, it's Pigeonhole, CEDA.pigeonhole.at, and the password is 2023 IWD. So jump in and ask some questions. But just on that, looking at growth in sort of non-traditionally female sectors, one of the things that gets called out here is the culture of those sectors, which isn't always that appealing for women to work in. But conversely, particularly in the construction sector here, we've seen research that really highlights the benefits of achieving greater diversity. How do you see the sort of cultural factors sort of playing out in influencing participation and actually progression once you're in the jobs? You talked about the sort of on-ramps and off-ramps. Is culture, how important is culture in influencing those?
I mean, culture is so important. I am a tried and true economist. I believe people respond to incentives. And what we see is when the culture is hostile, women don't go into the field because they know it. And if you want the best example of how that plays out, we can take something that was kind of new, computer science, 40 years ago. And we saw in the United States, women in computer science at reasonably high rates, roughly a third to 40% of the jobs in computer science were held by women. And women left that field in droves as their career progressed. And the number one reason that they cited for leaving computer science was hostile male work culture. And so what have we seen? We've seen the number of women or girls studying computer science fall by like more than half over the last 40 years. So women have been literally driven out, and not just driven out, but the younger women see like, whoa, these women, it's so bad they don't stick with it. I don't want to go into that. So culture matters, and we have to find ways to make sure that respectful, diverse cultures can persist. And that means not just giving lip service to the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really fundamentally in our heart, embracing the benefits that diversity, equity, and inclusion bring to any workforce. Because you need people to believe in why it matters. They really need to accept that and not just think, well, this is something that somebody's shoving down my throat. And I think that there are a lot of sectors of the economy in Australia and in the United States where, there's still a lot of people who are questioning the need or wondering just how bad that sexual harassment really was. Or, to quote a former prime minister, needing to talk to his wife to think about what sexual harassment would mean if it was happening to his own daughter to try to figure out why it might be a bad thing to be happening. So these things, they have to be cured first, and they can't be cured later.
Yeah. You talked about computer science. Obviously, one of the things that we called out in our work was the fact that we're sort of not seeing the growth, if you like, in participation of women in those sort of STEM-related sectors here in Australia. And, you talked about women wanting to move into the growth sectors. Well, that's absolutely, a growth sector and a growth opportunity. I'm just wondering, what you think's happening in the US. Are there things that we can learn from in the US in terms of efforts to achieve a lift in participation in STEM-related occupations in the US? We cite in our report that some of the programs that are happening over there that are more sort of mentor-focused rather than a one-and-done, this is why, science is great, seem to be having more impact.
So mentorship, sponsorship, all of these things really matter. So, there was a study in economics which showed just having a female economist come into the classroom and talk about like, oh, this is what my career was like, this is what I do, actually changes the likelihood that the female students would like to go on to study more economics. And it has no effect on the male economists. And that no effect is or the male students, that no effect is pretty good. It doesn't scare the guys off. And it does seem to encourage seem to encourage the girls. And I think that representation really matters. And, I'm going to come back to mentorship and sponsorship, but just to stick on representativeness for for a minute, it's really hard to do something if you're never seeing your world reflected in it, if you're always seeing yourself as an outsider. And so we often don't think hard enough about, well, what's going on with our teaching materials? And are we teaching in a way that this resonates with all my students, my female students, my students of color, my students from different backgrounds, my Asian students in Australia, that's obviously an important issue, and my Indigenous students. Like, you need all your students to feel like, oh, okay, people like me do this. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of ways to help people think about people like me do this. One is to show them people like you doing it. Another is to make sure that it's, the materials are all set, in a culturally, not just sensitive way, but in a way where, like, some students think, oh, this sounds like my life. Not every bit, but some of it has to sound like my life. Now, there's also this issue of formalizing relationships between mentors and sponsors. So the idea of the Old Boys Network was it didn't need to be formalized, was that guys found a way to find the guy that they connected with, that they could go for a beer with, that they could play around the golf with. And that guy would give them some advice about, here's how you get ahead. And not only would he give them some advice, but maybe he'd give them some tips like, hey, I hear this department's going to be looking to promote someone. Maybe you want to put your hat in the ring for that. Or maybe, your buddy speaks up for you in a meeting of senior partners and says, oh, so-and-so's doing great work. It was always informal. But the problem was that informal relationship only involved men, and usually white men. And what we had to think about is, well, how do we mimic that informal relationship in a way that includes everybody? And the only way to do that is to formalize it. And you can, we often hear this idea of mentors. Mentors can come in and tell you, here's some advice, here's what I did, here's what I think works because I'm a little bit wiser. But we also have the idea of sponsors. And you can call them a sponsor, which is what I think a lot of the business school literature calls them, or just, I like to say, champion. And that's somebody who's looking out for you, who's a little bit ahead of you and looking for those opportunities for you, reminding you and encouraging you to apply for them, perhaps putting in a good word for you. Those relationships are incredibly important. And, when I was a young assistant professor, I got very lucky, and a bunch of senior female economists decided that they were going to try to prove that these programs, mentorship and sponsorship, worked. And they got a big grant to do a randomized controlled trial where they had a whole bunch of assistant professors apply, a whole bunch of female assistant professors apply, and some got randomized in and some got randomized out, and they followed their careers for 10 years. I got randomized in, and, they always say, boy, they did a real good job with me. And, what they showed was that the women who got randomized in did better than the women who didn't. Mm-hmm. And I have now gone through and been a mentor in that program. And what I found took the most work, but was perhaps the most effective, was not just the mentoring, the mentoring of calling them, checking to see if they're okay, asking them, tell me what you're doing, or, you should be doing this or that, but actually being the one to say, okay, you should apply for, having a paper in this particular conference, and then also reaching out to the conference organizers and saying, hey, this person's really great, I hope you like their paper. Or, being the one to write a letter for them to say, hey, you should, consider them for this position. And it's that advocating, that championing, that sponsoring. It takes a lot of work, and people will do it naturally for the guys, and they don't do it naturally for people they don't feel quite as close to. And I think it's partially because it's driven a little bit by ego. This guy's like me. I want to see him succeed. And, they just sort of never feel that way about a person who doesn't look like them. And that's why we have to formalize those relationships.
Yeah, I think it's a really excellent point, Betsy, and it's something that, I've actually encountered through my career and in conversations with other women, that there is a difference between someone sort of giving you advice and someone who's then, quite frankly, prepared to stick their neck out or sort of, in quote unquote, risk their reputation in backing you into something. And I guess that's something for all of us to really reflect on, who we ask to do that for us, but also when we're in positions where we can have influence, the extent to which, we do that for others as well, because it is seemingly so important in terms of creating opportunities that might not otherwise exist. I'm going to now my iPad's flooded with questions, Betsy. Everyone's obviously super interested in the conversation. Just to sort of two questions that flow from that. First one, in Australia, one of the sort of benchmarks, if you like, is around success for women's progress is women on boards. And the number of women on boards. And obviously it's a bit of that point that you made about, you can't be what you can't see, to shorthanded. And so having women at the top really helps pull other women up. Now, I'm interested in one, is that as dominant in the US as it is here in a narrative? And two, if it's not women on boards, because most women aren't ever going to be on boards, what is the right metrics or the number of metrics that we should be really looking at to judge when we're making progress?
Yeah, women on boards is something that's gotten a lot of traction because we can count them, because it is small. Because it's small, we can say, what percentage it is. And I think actually Australia's doing okay on that. And there's mixed evidence on the boards issue, partially because sometimes what happens when you have quotas is the same woman just gets put on all the boards. And that gives you a loss of diversity in another way, right? Which is you have fewer different people on your boards. So I think you have to always weigh these things with the cost versus the benefits. The US, the women on boards is much lower. I think Australia is much more successful than the US. And I would probably back stronger rules in the US than what I would do in Australia, given where you're currently at. I think for Australia, the bigger problem is that it's hard to get women into leadership problems when half your women are working part-time. Mm-hmm. And that's a real fundamental problem. And, what are the metrics of success? Well, you want to look at things like who owns the businesses, who is in positions of authority and power. And so those are sort of senior management positions. And then this is where I think in some sense, occupational segregation does really matter, right? And this is a problem in the US as well, but I think it's sort of more problematic in Australia, given all the other things we've talked about, which is you got to have women in finance. That's where the money is. You got to have better diversity there. And, in some ways, the increased flexibility, I might hope, has actually going to help make some progress there. But honestly, I will never forget walking through the CBD of Sydney in sort of mid 2021 and thinking like all the women had been killed or something, because it was like all these finance men out for drinks at these outside bars and there wasn't a woman to be seen. And that was partially because so many people could work from home that the women were staying home and the men were going in the office. And that was creating its own kind of segregation. So I do worry about, making sure that when it comes to people who are going to have, political control, who are going to have financial control, who are going to have political power, financial power, that you're getting representation. And that's another reason why people focus on boards. But I think there's a broader lens that you can take to that. And certainly looking at C-level executives and management, broader, more than just looking at the board, is incredibly important.
So one of the questions that's popped up here relates directly to that point. And we've been talking about segregation across sectors, but even in sectors that are heavily female dominated, you see men rising to the top more. And the question that's asked here is that, most of the businesses in Australia, particularly bigger businesses, will have roughly 50-50 in their sort of pipeline when people come into the organisation. But of course, when you get to the top, it's still very, very male dominated. Now, childcare is obviously an issue. You've talked about the importance of sponsorship. Anything else that you would kind of highlight as needing to shift to get those women, moving up more equally into those leadership roles?
Well, this is, I'm going to circle back to something I'd said earlier, which is I think it's really important that we allow people to pause their career and then be able to still grow them on high gear. Because you might have a woman who was, working in a female-dominated occupation, who sort of did her work, was pretty good at her job, but because of family responsibilities, was not looking to move up. And then her kids get older, they're in high school, and she's all of a sudden ready for that next step. Do you have the mechanism in place to be like, oh, even though she's been sort of treading water for 5 years, we have a way to help her start to accelerate her career? I think that's important for the United States. I think it's important for Australia. You can't write people off because they weren't climbing the ladder quickly enough in their 30s and 40s. You gotta cast that wider net and look much more broadly. And I think it's really it's really important, and I think it really widens the way in which we think, because you're right. We tend to narrow in, and one of the reasons we narrow in is because we keep narrowing to the subset of people who have been able to stay the course and work everything is their job. And only in that narrow group of people who stayed the course the whole time do we think of our leadership team. But that makes us really insular, so I think that broadening is really important. And then I also think we have to change some of our notions about what a leader looks like, because we all know that, women can be the most organized, have the best, systematic plan for getting something done, but they may not be the loudest person in the room. They may not speak up quite as forcefully. And so how do we define a leader is, we have to broaden our definitions of what it means to be a leader. And I just dumped a lot of stereotypes out there. But the point is, with those kinds of stereotypes, is that we don't want women to have to act like stereotypical men to be a leader. We want people to be able to act however is natural for them, and for us to embrace the idea of different leadership styles as being really different ways for companies to thrive.
One of the issues that's come up, and it relates to this career pauses, is the issue of parenting responsibilities. And in Australia, where obviously the government's announced new paid parental, or much more generous paid parental leave, there is still work to be done on how that leave will be shared, if you like. At the moment, most paid parental leave, almost all of it is taken by women, and there is a push, to your point earlier about incentives, structuring paid parental leave on a use it or lose it basis, so that men, as predominantly the second carers, take more of that responsibility. What's your thought on that? Is there research that supports that, and what's the conversation happening in the US?
Well, let's start. I'll come back to the US in a minute. So first of all, I'm just going to tell you, I really just hate the phrases like primary care and secondary care, because, I believe kids need two parents who are all in on parenting. So if you've got two parents, it stinks if only one of them is all in on parenting and the other one's like, I don't know who these people are you brought into our household. They're your responsibility. So let's start to think about parenting as a joint venture. And the responsibilities in the household are going to be shared in different ways. But we need to think about two people as the potential co-equal raisers of these children. And I think to not have access to equal leave is really unfortunate, because what you do is when you have a policy that 99% of the leave is taken by women, you create this idea of a primary and secondary caregiver. The fathers who don't take any leave and their wives who are home for several months with the kids become nervous. They're not sure what to do. I'm not the expert. I defer to you. Well, once you start deferring, your kid doesn't have two equal parents anymore. They've got one parent and the person who takes orders from the parent. And that's no way to, like, I think, to raise kids. But it's also, it creates a really unfortunate dynamic in parenting and in work and in the family. So I don't think it's very, I think it can be quite detrimental to relationships too. So what happens though is that right now the social structure is such that men get more grief when they take leave. So their mates aren't on board. They're like, what are you doing? And their bosses might not be on board. And everybody expects the wife to do it. And so it can be really hard to be a cultural norm breaker. And so the reason that we just need to require a bigger share of it be taken by men is so that we can just have a break, a moment in time where we say, men are going to take more leave and we're all going to do it together. We're all going to dive in at the same time. And I'm not going to be seen as less committed to my job because I took that parental leave. And when men take that leave, they're going to find the kids are awesome, that they are going to find that they love having time with their kids. And now I'm going to give you some evidence from the United States. Is prior to the pandemic, men were extremely dissatisfied with how much time they got with their kids. So American men also don't spend as much time with their kids. During the pandemic, men became, when US was in shutdown and people were at home a lot, men became much more satisfied with the amount of time they got with their kids. Women, no, they didn't get more satisfied. They thought these kids are around a lot and I already had a lot of time with them. But the men, they liked it. And in survey data, the men said, I don't want to go back to doing what I was doing before. So I think that when the men try being with their kids, they're going to find they like it. So I think it's a great policy option. And I think if you just jump into it, what you'll see is that people like it. It improves parenting, it improves outcomes for kids, and it improves workplace equality. So it's just, and it improves relationships in the home. So it's just like win, win, win. So I'm strongly behind it. The US is in a much different place because we don't have any guaranteed leave when you have a child. You can't even take a paid day off to give birth to the child. So the US is just a very different mentality when it comes to paid leave. We don't have any, we don't take any. And some people get it through their employer, others don't. The companies, the big companies in the US that have seen the data on retention, on well-being, on productivity, have now started offering paid leave to their highly compensated workers. And they offer it equally to men and women. And it's not a tied family leave, it's tied to your job. So, you work at Google, you're going to get that paid time off from Google when you get a kid coming in the home, whether you're a man or a woman. And so, I think that we just see that those policies work really, really well.
Yeah. We've got 1 minute left. And there is a burning question here, which I think boils down to, based on everything you know about the labour market, which is a lot, what would your advice be to a young woman entering the workforce?
Well, I mean, I have to give you advice based on the world you currently live in, not the world I want you to live in. And the world you currently live in is one where things get a lot harder when you have kids. So I would sprint in my career as fast and as hard as I can to get where I want to be until I have kids, and understand that it's probably going to flatline at least a little bit. because even if you care a lot about your career, the society is not that structured. So that's why that early sprinting is important. And one last piece of advice, which is the most important career decision you're going to make, is the person you decide to live your romantic life with, your cohabiter, your partner, because that person's either going to be behind you 100% or they're going to be trying to drag you down.
Well, I knew our time, Betsy, was going to go really quickly, and so it has. But can I just thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and experience and advice. It's been super interesting. We started to see so many questions pour in through the pigeonhole. To those of you who ask questions, we always do try to have a look at those and think about how we can come back to them either in other forums or with some blogs or something like that. So the questions won't go unanswered, if I could put it that way. Some really great call outs for me, I think, Betsy, including that really important one about language and how we describe things. Can I say, as a secondary caregiver, that did resonate. And so note yourself to think very carefully about the language that we use and the stereotypes that we might be perpetuating ourselves without actually even realising it. So thank you to the audience for participating. Thanks so much for the questions. As I said, we'll try to find answers for them in other forums or in other ways. Lots more happening here at CEDA. Lots of conversations and events. Log on to the website ceda.com.au to see what's happening. On the live stream coming up in April, we've got a really interesting live stream on First Nations voices and embedding cultural awareness. So that would be an excellent one to jump onto. Thanks again so much. I look forward to either catching up on another live stream or a CEDA event soon. Have a great day.